Greetings. Today we're going to be talking about political violence in Indonesia, in particular the trajectory, variety and explanations for various forms of political violence that we've seen in Indonesia over the last 15 or so years, 15 to 20 years at least, since the transition to a more democratic system of government began in that country in 1998. My name's Edward Aspinall, by the way. I'm one of the Indonesia politics specialists here in the School of International Political and Strategic Studies. Now, our starting point for this discussion is an observation that's been made by many scholars who look at political violence. It's something of a consensus in the field. That is that there's something like an inverted U-shaped relationship between levels of political violence and regime form. In other words, in highly authoritarian political regimes, where there's a very effective surveillance apparatus and a very effective repressive apparatus, we relatively rarely, in some instances, but relatively rarely, have high levels of political violence because the government is effective at suppressing such violence. Similarly, in consolidated, effective and stable democratic regimes, we also tend to get relatively low levels of political violence. Of course, there are some exceptions here and there that we can all think of, but that's the general rule. It's in those regimes which are somewhere in between being fully democratic and fully authoritarian that we tend to see violence taking place at higher levels. This is because, of course, perhaps the regime doesn't have the full repressive capacity of a completely authoritarian regime, but they're also not necessarily as effective at satisfying the needs and aspirations of their populations as can sometimes take place in democratic regimes. And this goes for countries, of course, not only that are sort of semi-democratic or semi-authoritarian, but also those that are making the transition from one state to another. And as we see, this will be really relevant to our discussion of Indonesia in these next few minutes. So, brief historical background, or just a brief remark on the background to bear in mind, is that Indonesia, for a period of 30 years, the immediate predecessor to the period we're talking about today, was ruled by a classic Cold War national security state. The President Suharto, the man in the camouflage outfit you see at the front there, was a president for that long period, and his main support base during his period in the presidency was the Indonesian military. And you had the military institutionally embedded in the political system. You had a strong national security ideology that deemed all forms of opposition to the regime as being not only anti-government, but in some ways against the Indonesian national character, and you had a strong stress on stability. Now, this, of course, as we all know, this regime eventually came to an end in 1997, or it began to become unsteady in 1997 when a major financial crisis took hold in much of Southeast Asia, but then the regime finally fell as a result both of mass peaceful political protests, but also as a result of violent rioting in some of the major urban centers of Indonesia, including Jakarta. And President Suharto resigned in May of 1998, making way to the beginning of a rather messy transition to democracy. And it's after this period that we see those earlier remarks I make about an inverted U-shaped relationship between regime form and levels of political violence, we see this becoming very relevant in Indonesia. And we can see this just through a couple of graphs. So there have been a number of scholars or a number of endeavors taken to try and measure the levels of conflict that occurred in Indonesia in that period. This was one of the earliest attempts to measure. The scholars who wrote this paper just tried to record reports of conflict deaths through Indonesian newspapers. And you can see this really dramatic peak of violence occurring within just a few years of the political transition in 1998, precisely as Indonesia went through that transition from a highly controlled, highly authoritarian form of government in the 90s through to a rather messy form of democracy in the early 2000s. This particular graph excludes conflict deaths caused in the major separatist provinces of East Timor. At that time, East Timor was still, at least until, well, 1999-2000, was still a province of Indonesia. It also excludes conflict deaths in Aceh and Papua. So this is mainly looking at communal conflicts, cases where rival ethnic or religious groups were fighting one another. There's also a very useful website which I would encourage you all to have a look at. You can jot down its name here. This is the National Violence Monitoring System in Indonesia, which has developed and maintained this monitoring system for recording both conflict incidents and conflict deaths, and they've got a lot of other data from a number of high conflict provinces of Indonesia. So the difference between this graph and the one I just showed you on the previous page is that this also includes conflict deaths caused in the provinces of Aceh and Papua, which were the major sites of separatist conflict. And you can see here that by far the highest source of conflict deaths was in fact the province of Aceh, where there was a major separatist conflict, and that the peak of deaths was also a little later than we saw in that earlier graph. But as I said, I would encourage you to take a look at that website. They have a lot of interesting data there that you can look at and play around with, create your own graphs if you're interested in particular forms of conflict and particular hypotheses or explanations for it. Okay, so that's the sort of the general picture. What were the varieties of conflict that we saw afflicting Indonesia in this period? In fact, you can categorize this violence in many different ways. I just want to give you mention a few of the major forms or varieties of violence. The first form of violence that claimed large numbers of lives in that period and since is communal violence. Sometimes in the literature on Indonesia, this is known as horizontal violence. The idea is that you've got two communities who are or indeed defined by some sort of identity category, usually religious or ethnic. You have two communities sort of equally on an equal footing, anyway, two separate communities fighting one another. The most or the one form of violence in this category took place in May 1998 when there were major anti-Chinese riots in Jakarta, for instance. But we've got also major inter-ethnic and religious conflicts in other parts of Indonesia, many of which claimed many hundreds and in some cases thousands of deaths. So in two provinces in Kalimantan, or the Indonesian part of the island of Borneo, we had ethnic conflicts where the targets were migrants from the island of Madura. So these were conflicts that weren't defined in by religious categories. Some of the people attacking the Maduris were Christian or animist Dayaks, but some were Malay Muslims, whereas the Maduris themselves are Muslims. In contrast, in parts of eastern Indonesia, so that was central Sulawesi, Maluku and North Maluku, we saw conflict that was mainly along religious lines between Christian and Muslim communities. So they're the major sites of communal violence that took place in Indonesia during those years. And there haven't been such mass instances of communal violence since that time. But it's important to note that there are relatively at a relatively frequent rate, much smaller scale and more isolated and sporadic forms of communal violence still persist right through parts of Indonesia. Then, in addition, of course, and here we have the major sites of separatist conflict. Of course, East Timor became independent right at the beginning of the period we're talking about. Aceh, there was a major separatist insurgency with a very powerful guerrilla army. And Papua, which is often in the news in Australia in particular, but where in fact the separatist movement is much less well organized than it ever was in Aceh, where they don't have much in the way of armed strength. Now, there are of course other forms of political violence in Indonesia. Terrorism, of course, is one. Hasn't claimed nearly as many lives as these other forms of violence I've been talking about. And Greg Feely will be talking about that topic, so I won't deal with it much there.